If you're watching this, chances are you're a hardcore gamer. But how would I know that, just because you decided to click on a video? I'd probably never met you or know anything about your experiences with gaming. Still, clicking on this video might let on more than you may think. Gaming as a hobby has been studied intensely since its inception. Everything from the who, what, when, where, why, and how people play games has been the topic of conversation of everyone from the first-time gamer to the veteran researcher. One of the first things people are drawn to when learning about any topic are how they can be broken down into categories. This is because categorization is one of the most common and effective ways we compartmentalize information, and it helps us to retain it for later. In gaming, this inherently leads us to wanting to categorize the gamers themselves. The categories that have seemed to stick around in both recreational and academic discourse are casual and hardcore. There have been many attempts over the years that have tried to pin down some sort of definition for these labels. You probably have your own definition that you've developed either consciously or simply through your experiences. I certainly have one, and putting those conceptions to the side can be difficult, but I'd argue it's helped me to understand what defines different types of gamers in a more real sense, compared to the typical talking points you see online. Or in the words of one study, past research suggests that not only is this term currently poorly defined and perhaps paradoxical, but there are meaningful social and cultural justifications for advancing its understanding. Initially, it seems like no one can agree on even basic distinctions between casual and hardcore gamers. Many researchers have made attempts, and many have failed to find satisfying results. Naturally, trying to pin down something this abstract isn't an exact science, as you can see in one of the most confusing charts I've ever tried to decipher. Even developers have a hard time with the labels. Mark Rubin, a former executive producer at Infinity Ward, said the following in an interview with IGN. It's kind of a weird, ironic thing to say. They aren't hardcore gamers, or even gamers, but they play Call of Duty every night, and those guys are going to continue to play regardless of platform. But thankfully we don't have to debate anymore since it was settled back in 2012. Well, maybe not quite. The lack of conclusive arguments led many to determine that the distinction is useless and only serves to stoke online arguments, since casual is one of the most traditional insults gamers have used against each other. I'm going to disagree with that though. I think there are several lessons both players and developers can take from better understanding the possible ways to define these labels, since it gives an insight into the minds of different types of players. Most people wouldn't describe themselves as such, but look a little closer and their habits can likely be understood along casual and hardcore lines. There are a few things that probably come to mind when deciding which group a gamer falls into. Hardcores play for competition, casuals play for fun. Hardcores play all day every day, no matter their responsibilities. Casuals play when they feel like it and have nothing else going on. Casuals are generally more circumstantial and social. Hardcores are generally more consistent and individual. What's fascinating is there's actual evidence from researchers and formal studies that a lot of these characteristics line up just like you think they would. These studies have reasonably become more common as more people have become gamers. The rise in recent years can largely be attributed to developments in the industry in the late 2000s and early 2010s. The release of the Wii, Guitar Hero, and the advent of Facebook and mobile gaming all brought in groups of people whose previous experiences with gaming ended at getting a decent score in Pac-Man. In his book, Casual Revolution, game designer and professor Jesper Juul said, "It dawned on me that this was not about video games becoming cool, but about video games becoming normal. Normal because these new games were not asking players to readjust their busy schedules. Normal because one did not have to spend hours to get anywhere in a game. Normal because the games fit the social context in which people were already spending their time. Normal because these new games could fulfill the role of a board game, or any party game. Or in a more basic sense, to play video games has become the norm. To not play video games has become the exception." Today, new technologies and techniques continue to expand the boundaries of what an average gamer is. The continued success of MMOs and cooperative nature of battle royales and extraction shooters have highlighted the importance of social elements in games, allowing experienced gamers to show new players the ropes more easily. And like the Wii did years ago, modern virtual reality bypasses the traditional need for controller knowledge, drawing in people who would have never thought they'd be a gamer. It's also a plus that a lot of games in VR, like the Wii, aren't about murdering things, leading to a more diverse range of experiences to draw a more diverse range of people in. This influx of gamers has made the waters between casuals and hardcores a lot murkier. Since gaming is so much more expansive now than even a few decades ago, players can't simply be defined solely by what games they play or what they play them on. Even the most inexperienced casuals can exhibit what are commonly thought of as hardcore tendencies for periods of time, which brings up an interesting paradox. A casual game is sufficiently flexible to be played with hardcore time commitment, but a hardcore game is too inflexible to be played with a casual time commitment. At a very basic level, all gamers are casuals. Now, before everyone gets their pitchforks out, I'm not saying you suck at video games. What I am saying is before someone can become a hardcore fan of any hobby, not just gaming, they have to test the waters to see if they like it and can fit it into their life. This might be the equivalent of watching the most popular hits in a new genre of movies, or practicing a sport for the first time. Many gamers, whether they're casual or hardcore, get into the hobby in a similar way, with a trailer for a game grabbing their interest, or their friends offering to teach them how to play something they have thousands of hours in. Hardcores have inherently been, and will always be, a subset of gamers who engage with gaming past these initial casual experiences. Much like someone's mental health or relationship status, what type of gamer someone is isn't necessarily binary and can be displayed on a spectrum. This has led to some considering spaces between casuals and hardcores called core gamers. These players exhibit more hardcore habits than a typical casual player, but might not necessarily meet enough to be considered a part of the tiny hardcore player base of any given game. In an article so old it has his AOL website linked at the bottom, game designer Ernest Adams said this: "Yeah, you can even go off the sides of the spectrum to another type of gamer some would consider hyper-casual. Games developed for these players are practically entirely dedicated to attracting a casual player base that would never normally play games. They focus on shorter play sessions and minimizing frustration that other games present that might get a typical non-gamer to put it down and never return. It can be seen as a counterpoint to more intense genres, like grand strategy games that have a long playtime requirement and a level of dedication to form a deep knowledge base." There have been attempts to further define the spectrum with labels that can easily slot into casual or hardcore buckets. One study succinctly attempted to define gamers on a casual-hardcore assortment scale by 4 factors: their monetary, cultural, emotional, and time investments in games. Another put together a hardcore scorecard with criteria focused more on the games themselves, like whether a game is an FPS, challenging, or typically played in short bursts. The assumption being that the higher the score of a game, the more likely a player of the game is to be a hardcore gamer. And while I do think these studies paint a decent picture, they still leave a bit of ground untouched. The most clear factor to me in bridging the gap from a casual to a hardcore in any subject is following external coverage of it. Anything from podcasts to video essays to interviews, or simply keeping up with the most recent news more generally would fall under this category. This research has always been core to my personal experience with games, and has allowed me to think about and appreciate aspects of them that I had never considered before. And as a result, I've built up a foundational knowledge of video game history, famous developers, and the reputations of game franchises and studios. I'm able to participate in discussions with other hardcore gamers where a more casual player listening in wouldn't even know where to start. And this is reflected in research too. In a study which studies differences in video game players, time spent researching games was found to be the largest categorical gap between casuals and hardcores. Like NPR said, that's right, gamers stay up at night and watch other people play video games, the way sports fans watch football. It's about the most hardcore thing a gamer can do. But even this can get tricky, since plenty of gaming content is targeted at more casual players, like guides, for systems that any player would be better off for understanding. A good example of this is build guides, which can help to onboard players that are new to a game and get them a feel for a game's skill tree. Still, even though this type of research is engaged in by casual and hardcore followers of a subject, hardcores typically make up a more consistent, albeit smaller source of engagement because of their higher enthusiasm and dedication compared to casuals. They're also, in my experience, more likely to have skepticism towards the subject because of their higher level of understanding about the negative aspects of individual games and the industry as a whole. It's also been found that hardcore gamers focus on competition, challenge, and excitement as core motivations when compared to more casual gamers. These line up with what I, and probably many other people, would think of when picturing why a typical hardcore gamer would play any given game. It's probably because of these motivations that hardcores are more likely to try harder difficulty modes and endgame content based on having more experience from repeat playthroughs and being more comfortable with a game or genre. The curiosity to try out different strategies or choices and attempts to achieve mastery over a game's systems even has an entire dedicated community. Though it is worth noting that completion and fantasy are common motivations for both casuals and hardcores. In this way, hardcores have a wider variety of more intense reasons why they play games, but casuals still find things that they can get out of games that they can't find easily in other forms of entertainment that they might enjoy. There are still the more familiar factors that come to mind when distinguishing hardcores from casuals. In one study on differences in motivation and engagement in gamers, the criteria were as follows. These considerations line up with a trend I've noticed that something which is usually considered in this debate might not be as much of a factor as it's generally thought to be. Skill. This is part of where the use of casual as a demeaning term comes in. I would generally consider myself a hardcore gamer, but I've still gotten absolutely demolished in games by some of my friends who exhibit more casual tendencies. I think people typically confuse a hardcore gamer for someone who's good at games for someone who is actually just really passionate about them, no matter what their skill level actually is. And this passion might be the most important factor of all. I'd argue this intangible passion is what leads to hardcore players spending more of their time and money on games, rather than spending time and money leading to the dedication and passion that typically leads someone to call a person hardcore. Think about it. As an example, of all the people in the world that own Steam Decks right now, how many do you think were passionate about games before they purchased one? Chances are they have another usable computer that can run games, and a Steam library filled to the brim, since the Deck's biggest selling point is having them at your fingertips. They also likely have to be tuned into gaming, and PC gaming specifically, to have even heard of the device in the first place, since Valve isn't renting out billboards like Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony. Hardcore gamers are usually early adopters of consoles and graphics cards for similar reasons, and spending these larger chunks of money leads them to being more likely to spend more time playing and researching games in their free time, that lines up with proven psychological behaviors around investment. A few other factors that I think are worth considering are someone's willingness to seek out new genres, play indie games, invest a large amount of time into a single game, and persevere to learn new or unfamiliar game systems. I'd wager that a player engaging in these behaviors would be more likely to be considered a hardcore gamer than those who don't. Casuals, in my experience, wouldn't typically do these things without a recommendation or help from a more hardcore follower of a game or gaming in general. Many would say these labels don't matter, and only serve as fuel for the tribalism that's ever present in games discussions. Whether you agree with any one Reddit post or research study or not, it can't be denied that the more lenses we look through gives us a better picture of the modern gaming landscape. For players, this can help to overcome misunderstandings between those with fundamentally different views and experiences with gaming. Many hardcores can fall into the trap of not realizing they're in a bubble, in the sense that they care about things casuals have never heard about, or don't want to, or simply don't have time to. Where this can normally lead to talking past each other and creating misinformed opinions, it can instead create opportunities to learn about new concepts or trends. These labels of casual and hardcore are important for players to see how others' gaming habits relate to their own, which can help them understand why people might have such different opinions on games and who developers are really designing for in any individual release. On the other end, developers can use player types in combination with statistical data to create experiences that are more meaningful and fun by keeping in mind groups of players that are motivated for a variety of reasons. Misunderstanding the player base when making decisions can lead to disconnects with them and a death spiral of development that leads to a game that's either too wide to cater to anyone or so niche it never gets many players in the first place. Understanding how these decisions impact multiple different types of players can help develop tighter, more focused, and ultimately more engaging experiences. In this sense, features like modifiable difficulty that are typically thought of as made for and appealing to more casual players can actually be developed with hardcores in mind as well, allowing them to crank up the intensity should they wish to do so. As we've seen, the definitions of who's a casual or hardcore depend on a variety of factors, how they relate to the games people play, and especially who you're talking to. This doesn't mean that trying to define them isn't useful though. For everyone from new players to veteran developers, knowing about these concepts can help to prevent the misunderstandings and disconnects that seem to arise so often these days. And while it might not be critical for your enjoyment of playing games, knowing about the different biases and experiences you might have from other gamers can help to understand gaming at a more fundamental level. Whether that's in watching a review, listening to a GDC presentation, or simply talking with a friend, learning these differences can help players try new things they've never considered before. Ultimately, participating in tribalism by forming in-groups and out-groups without a second thought is a natural human phenomenon that can feel good. But if we acknowledge it though, we can look past the stereotypes and think from someone else's perspective more often. Who knows what ideas and games could come out of it? I think it's worth a shot. And if you want to know my personal definition, it's simply someone who has forgotten more about gaming in the industry than the average gamer will ever know.